What am I? Best answer, a superorganism. Part 2, origins, fortifications, and common arguments. Moving on from liquidation of individualism, we will examine the origins and fortifications of our perception and some of the common arguments used to defend our choice in that belief. From Tier 0 through Tier 3 consciousness, there is either no awareness, there's hive mentality, there's tribalism, and as Tier 3 starts to approach Tier 4, some aspects of individualistic perception begin to emerge as our neurological state increases in complexity. At Tier 4, new perceptual paradigms are beginning to compete with our natural tribal state. The parietal lobe is what processes sensory information, of which allows us to know where our foot is without looking at it, among other things. This sensory ability was useful for survival, and epigenetic triggers reacted to that usefulness, and natural selection played a part more than likely also, in perpetuating the prevalence of forms of consciousness with better and better parietal lobes. The stronger our parietal lobes became, the more our concept of self became apparent. There was a long period of time that we were still largely tribal, while our burgeoning perception of self was emerging gradually over time. Our parietal lobes were not the only areas of the brain that were increasing in complexity and power throughout this same period of time. These other areas of the brain that were increasing in power gave rise to other contributing factors also. Our communications, curiosities, and ability to articulate questions that related to those other areas of the brain increased in complexity in tow. Environmental factors such as scarcity of resources of different varieties, such as food, and population increases also likely help to perpetuate concepts of individualism because of the need to stake claims on these limited resources. We were also forced to make part of some of our tribes leave the area to find new resources to live off of. That was likely part of the birth of our tendency for compartmentalization. Somewhere along the way, we imagined gods and a variety of mysticism in order to explain away the many curious questions we could not answer. Over the course of time, the religions and myths increased in complexity, and concepts were added to explain things like death. The concept of a soul allowed us to believe we live forever, and therefore we no longer had to fear death. The myths and religions themselves allowed us a psychological security blanket that protected us from our fear of not knowing what the fuck was going on in general. Those factors yielded massive cultural bias that fortified our concepts of individualism. Eastern and Western philosophy clash in a major way because either side threatens to tear away the other's psychological security blanket. What I'm proposing will allow them to meet halfway and unify under the tangible enlightenment of scientific literacy, combined with logic and critical thinking. Now for some common arguments. A common argument for individualism is that there is competition for resources, and in the analogy of the Pando tree, still fits, but does not change the overall moral of the story. And here's how. This upshoot is consuming more resources from the medium, which is the universe, planets, and stars' charged particles. This upshoot is also taking up more space and producing more oxygen. If we were to apply that to what we call human, the human would be producing more thoughts or creations, manifestations into reality. Each upshoot could represent a branch of genetic memory that is unfolding into our reality. The more complex this phenotype expression becomes, then the more resources it will require. Inevitably, that means other phenotype expressions will not have certain resources available, and in some cases, those other phenotype expressions will become a food source for the more demanding expressions. If one phenotype expression is recycled back to the medium and turned into food, then those particles become part of the remaining biological expressions of consciousness. Matter can neither be created nor destroyed. It's just a process of transmutation. Full Metal Alchemist, I'm sure, would enjoy this concept. Then there's the matter of equality that tends to drive a wedge of separation and fuels our perception of self also. This is very short-sighted. More realistically, we are all equal, but just not equal in the same way. The variety of phenotype expressions of our biology that exist increase our chances of survival and our abilities to adapt to the ever-increasing complexity that we face from the natural laws of emergence. All forms of life serve a purpose, and without all these jobs being completed, the ecosystem may fall apart. Common knowledge for ecologists. Even if it wasn't going to fall apart, that's beside the point. In order to process the universe in the form of thinking, we require a great deal of support. For example, if not for the efforts of all of our society, we would not have the spare calories to think. study, create, or invent anything. No matter what any of us does, it is a group effort. Again, individualism is an oversimplification, and we are being short-sighted to the point of delusional by inserting that perceptual paradigm. It's become a belief, like a religion. Now, if we were to look at what we call an individual human body from a different perspective and say that there are no obvious roots physically connecting us to one another, like the pondo tree, well, we can't stop right there and say that we have it all figured out. Let's look at it a bit closer. Just because we can't see it with our eyes doesn't mean that we haven't adapted tools to look closer and therefore expanding our awareness as well as our perception of reality. For every cell in our bodies, there are 10 bacteria. Within the majority of our cells is a mitochondria, and those mitochondria are basically the engines of our cells. The mitochondria are very closely genetically related to bacteria. In regards to physiology of our bodies, there are bacteria that live in our digestive organs that serve many functions. A function that is particularly interesting is that some can communicate with us and create cravings for what they want to eat. Did you think that you were choosing what you wanted to eat? Not really. It's not that simple. So, we are a mass of microbiological symbiosis. I'll put a link in the description to a video about the theory of endosymbiosis which supports what I'm saying. So, our roots are connected through masses of microbiological symbiosis, and we are connected through genetics. What about my body, you say? What about the brain? What about the central nervous system? Well, in regards to the body, a little known fact is that over a 7 to 10 year period of time, we discard over 90% of our physical matter and replace it with new physical matter. Cells die, and when we eat food, that material is used to create new cells. This is a constant process happening every day. We die and are reborn every day. The genetic memory is what keeps the copy going, and that genetic memory is not yours alone. You say, but wait, we all have our own genetic code. Well, we are back to our theories and interpretations combined with excessive compartmentalizations muddying the waters of our perceptions. We mustn't forget that the majority of our genetics is the same as many forms of complex biology, and we are relatively certain that all the code has the same origin. We are what happens when microbiology adapts, evolves, and starts to work together in communities. Then emergence, as well as chaos, randomly created consciousness. Entropy fuels evolution. So as for the central nervous system and the brain, none of that is a singular item, but rather a community of many smaller things. The largest piece of evidence that supports individualism is the fact that the brain does not discard physical material and replace it over a 7 to 10 year period like the body does. But the brain does change shape, and as we grow from child to adult, it is gaining mass. We don't have the same brain that we've had our whole lives, even if it is made of the same matter. As for our memories, a lot of those memories need to be re-accessed and re-fortified in the process, or we lose them. Live long enough and hypothetically, all of them could be replaced. Really is use it or lose it with this thing we call the brain. We hold on to individualism. We tell ourselves that this happened to us, and that this is my memory, and that this is what makes me, me. We continue to fortify our concepts of individualism through self-affirmation, instead of letting go and saying that we just don't know. So what about my thoughts, you say? Well, are they really yours individually? Where do you think the thoughts come from? Rather nearsighted to claim they originate in your mind alone, I propose we think nothing alone. All thoughts we have are based on what we have experienced, and largely what we have learned. What we have experienced is the winds of cause and effect, if you will. That is not yours alone. The information we learn is all part of a massive thought wave of combined consciousness. Again, it did not originate from your perceived self. Can we own a thought? No. We can channel information from the wave of combined consciousness or combined knowledge pools and pass it along into the wave, but we cannot possess or claim ownership of these thoughts. Something else to consider is that our lives are like a fart in a tornado from a universal perspective. We can pretend we own something, but no sooner do we insert that concept of ownership, we experience entropy and re-enter the process of transmutation. In actuality, we pretended to own something for a very short amount of time. There are many more aspects of this equation to examine, but let's not allow this video to go on any longer than the majority's attention span, and keep in mind that this is not a detailed blueprint of the theory being proposed, rather this is the bare bones moral of the story portrayed in simple language. Thanks so much for the careful examination. Thanks for joining the Thought Revolution. Please subscribe, thumb up, most importantly, share the series on all of your social media profiles. Up next in part 3, the psychological effects as well as the damages that come from this perceptional paradigm of excessive individualism.